Well, I'm starting off my second early Renaissance painting lecture with a work that isn't a painting, it's an engraving. I'm going to be talking a lot more about engraving techniques in the next unit, since Northern Renaissance artists excelled at this medium. But what's especially noteworthy about Palaiuolo, I checked the pronunciation of that, is his exploration of human anatomy in the throes of violent activity. You see this in his sculpture of Hercules wrestling Antaeus as well. Notice the extremely lean and muscular bodies in both the engraving and the sculpture. The term for this, which I'd never encountered before, by the way, is écorché, as if without skin or skinned. In 1430, Donatello's nude David had shocked a lot of Florentines. By 1475, the depiction of male nudes was more widely accepted, although not, as we'll see in a moment, by Savonarola. But note how much more this statue breaks out of the block into negative space. We'll see more of this when we get to Michelangelo. Now, Luca Signorelli expanded on this preoccupation with bodies that were violently twisted. But in this case, they're twisted because they're struggling with the devil. These are bodies being cast into hell. The subject matter was especially popular further north, as we'll see in the next unit. But the context for this painting was, in fact, the fiery preaching of the monk Savonarola, who warned Florentines that they were heading to hell if they did not abandon their materialistic ways and especially their wicked art. So, let's go back to the Medici video and learn a little bit about Savonarola, who introduced the term Bonfire of the Vanities into our language. I've cut this into 3 separate units. As always, I recommend the entire video, which also includes some interesting discussion of Botticelli. Well, on that less than cheerful note, we leave Florence to travel to Rome. In the late 15th century, Pope Sixtus IV summoned artists to decorate the newly constructed Sistine Chapel, the Pope's private chapel. These artists included Botticelli, Ghirlandaio, and Perugino, whose painting of Christ delivering the keys of the kingdom to St. Peter is included here, and the painting's notable for several reasons. By now, you should recognize the clear mathematical linear perspective. In this case, the patterns of the square of the paving make it particularly apparent. The painting lovingly replicates classical architecture. Look at that Roman arch on the left, in particular left and the right, excuse me. Now, the building in the center, although clearly classical in design, is more of a fantasy temple. I would say the dome in some ways resembles the Duomo in Florence. But it's the content or subject that I really want to focus on. It's especially appropriate for Rome. If you remember when I talked about the unhappy 14th century, the papacy had gone through some very hard times. It was exiled to Avignon for many years, part of a struggle between the French king and the church. Then there were 2 popes, one in Avignon and one in Rome for a brief period. There were actually 3 popes. And then the papacy was reestablished in Rome, but there was a strong feeling within the church that popes needed to reassert their authority and that Rome needed to be reestablished as the central city of the church. And this painting is really a propaganda. It's part of the effort to show that the popes were descendants of St. Peter, and that Christ gave the keys to the kingdom to St. Peter, and therefore this is the true church, and the Pope is its true leader. Now, we're going to spend a lot more time in Rome when we get to the next chapter in the High Renaissance. But for now, I want to move on to 2 smaller Renaissance cities. You saw this slide in my architectural lecture, but I'm pretty sure I failed to mention that this famous classically inspired church knows the Roman arch again and the Greek pediment facade. They're really kind of combined in one building, a hybrid that would not have existed perhaps in the actual ancient world. But at any rate, I did not mention that it was located not in Florence, where most of the buildings we were looking at were located, but in fact in Mantua. Mantua was a northern Italian city ruled by the princely family, the Gonzagas. You recognize that name, I suspect. Now, Cosimo de' Medici might have preferred that his family home not flaunt the family wealth, but the Marchese of Gonzaga did not share this view. He and his fellow princes, for the most part, saw an impressive palace as a symbol of authority, of power, of wealth. And he hired the noted Venetian painter Andrea Mantegna to decorate several of the palace's rooms. Now, like many of his contemporaries, Mantegna was fascinated with mathematical perspective. He also immersed himself in the study of classical antiquity. And like most Renaissance painters, he married classical themes and images of traditional Christian themes in iconography. But Montaigne took all of these tendencies to a new extreme. What you're really seeing is the Renaissance on steroids, if you will. And you'll see that in this and the following paintings. In your homework for last night, you saw a podcast about these rooms. So I'll recap quickly. What's most amazing about this room is that the architectural features are all painted on. The doorway is the only actual architectural feature. Everything else is illusion. And this illusionistic painting will become increasingly popular into the High Renaissance and even more in the Baroque era. Remember the architectural illusionism of the wall paintings in Pompeii. Now, Montaigne would not have known these works. Pompeii wouldn't be, excavated for centuries. But I could imagine the College Board pairing those works, so it's something to think about. So this is my favorite element of the room. It's a false oculus, a false opening, where the sky is painted in, and what I really love are these putti that look like they're going to drop onto the heads of people, or at least drop something onto the heads of the people standing below. A couple of terms, and I don't think these were included in the slides that were handed out to you, but you need to know them. Trompe l'oeil is just French for fool the eye, and we'll see more of this painting technique as we continue through the course. Desoto ensue simply means from below looking upwards, and it was a favorite painting technique of Andrea Mantegna. This image, by the way, is not in your book, but I bet you've seen it. It's one of the most famous Renaissance images, and it is, in fact, the Gonzaga family. That's the patriarch there sitting on the throne. One of the most interesting features of this painting, by the way, and you're going to see this when we get to the Baroque Spanish painter Velázquez, is the dwarf, the woman in the bottom right as you look at the painting, staring out at us, really the one figure in this painting that's clearly looking directly at us. It was common for courts to have dwarves or little people as part of their court. But what's interesting here, and really an element of Renaissance humanism, is she is not depicted as a freak, but as a person. She has a great deal of dignity and presence. You're going to see this in Velázquez's famous dwarf as well. By the way, I also really love these arrogant young men on the right who have come to be sort of icons of the Renaissance. This is a stunning and in many ways disturbing painting. This was a small painting, only about 2 by 2 feet. And actually it was found in Montaigne's studio after his death. Apparently he carried it around with him, kind of like a rosary, something that aided him in his prayers and his devotions. From a religious standpoint, I think this is an extraordinarily powerful image of Christ's suffering and death. It's also a rather extreme exploration of the potential use of perspective to draw the viewer into a painting, into a three-dimensional space, even though all paintings are, of course, two-dimensional. So note how these feet not only hang off the bed, they kind of push into our face. At Jesus' side, you see kneeling his mother and just a bit of the Apostle John. Again, continuing with this extreme realism, Mantegna paints not the sweet young Madonna, so beloved of Botticelli, for example, or Fra Angelico, but the mourning older woman. We're seeing the humanism of the Renaissance, the individuality. Mantegna also worked in Padua, very near Venice, still another of these smaller cities that were centers of Renaissance art. Here we see a fresco that he painted on the walls of a church in Padua. The fresco, alas, was destroyed in World War II, which may be why your textbook has it in black and white. But when I went to find a photo I could include in the PowerPoint, lo and behold, I found one in color. This fresco offers us another example of Mantegna playing with the position of the viewer. The highly technical term for this is worm's eye view painting. In other words, the artist intends that we view it from a point well below the ground line. But that raises a question. What's wrong with this picture? Well, from a dramatic and compositional standpoint, I'd say nothing. It packs a punch. But in this painting, Mantegna quite deliberately breaks some of the rules of perspective that we know perfectly well from his other works he had fully mastered. But if we're looking from below, as we clearly are, the building should narrow and converge at the top. It doesn't. Instead, Mantegna decides to maintain the building as a unified conceptual whole. So we really get this, this Roman classical architecture. Again, artistically, compositionally, this seems like a smart idea, but it is not optically correct. It is not true perspective. Note that the Roman arch and barrel vault are very similar to Alberti's design for the church in Padua. That was almost certainly not an accident. And so finally we come to my favorite of the so-called princely court cities, Urbino. Now, Urbino's ruling prince was the most famous condottiere or mercenary soldier of his day, Federico da Montefeltro. And by the way, he was decorated by almost all the crowned heads of Europe. He even was awarded the Order of the Garter. Sorry, the Order of the Garter. I can't believe I'm having an Alzheimer's moment. By the King of England. He was famous first because he apparently never lost a battle, but he was also famous because he could not be bribed into switching sides. A lot of these condottieri were not only sold to the highest bidder, they would change sides when somebody raised the bid. Not the Duke of Urbino. You may have heard that the definition of an honest politician is when he's bought, he stays bought. Well, Federico was an honest condottiere. He also used the fortune that he amassed as a general to support the population of Urbino. He was a great benefactor, and to beautify the city and to patronize the arts. In fact, he was really second only to Cosimo de' Medici as an Italian patron of the arts. He also amassed a huge library of classical works and apparently actually read a lot of these works in between battles. Really an amazing man. The Duke's favorite artist was Piero della Francesca. Piero was among the most mathematical of a very mathematical group of early Renaissance painters. Note the careful perspective and, of course, the classical influence. This, by the way, is a Sacra Conversazione, which is a tableau in which figures from different historical eras appear together as in a sacred conversation. Piero della Francesca was not only fascinated by geometry, he also explored the properties of light. We'll see more attention to light as we move into later Renaissance and even more the Baroque period. But Piero della Francesca's work was in this regard ahead of its time. Notice especially the strong shadow cast against the back wall and the way the Madonna's face is illuminated by natural light. Remember that in Gothic painting and medieval painting, the light tended to come from within the religious figure as a sign of their sacredness, again, a conceptual perspective. A real light from identifiable sources is going to be showing up in painting now. This painting isn't in your book, but you've seen it before, I suspect. I love it. It seems very clear to me from this portrait that the Duke of Urbino, that's our buddy Federico da Montefeltro, was not especially vain. And in fact, his misshapen nose was partly his own creation. As a young man, he was blinded during a jousting tournament, and he was worried that this was going to hurt his aim. And so he had a physician cut away part of his nose to make sure that he could sight his weapon clearly. That is dedication. His wife, Battista, had died before this portrait was painted, so her pale skin is not just a reflection of her status as an aristocratic lady, but also her status as a corpse. I love these portraits, especially the Duke. We really see the development of portraiture and the humanistic impulse to capture the subject's true personality. Well, I rather hate to leave Urbino, but in our next lecture, we will return first to Florence and then to Rome, where high Renaissance artists such as Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael, Michelangelo, and Titian would take painting and sculpture to new heights.